Hello, welcome to a new video. Recently I've done a video about my favourite music, so I wanted to follow this up with my favourite books. So if you're interested at all, please stay tuned. I've got a whole pile of books here, which you can't see, but there's plenty of them. So I think I'm going to start with some childhood favourites of mine. In case you didn't know, I am ethnically Russian, but lived most of my life in Germany. But I do have a few Russian books from my childhood. So this one, for example, are the stories of the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen. And this is just a collection of his stories. Here's a little picture of him. And there are just a few beautiful drawings. I'm pretty sure that my grandma and maybe even my mother used to read me these stories, and then I would just read them myself. And I love reading fairy tales in general. But before we get to that, here's another one. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. I think that's what they call it in English, perhaps. Again, we've got beautiful artwork. And I remember that I would read this book quite a lot. Then I've got more fairy tales. I've got this lovely book, which is Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales, and these are all in English. When I was a child, I was reading them in German, or experiencing them in German, but it's really nice just to have an entire collection also in English to be able to read and to read to myself or future children and so on. And then I also have a book of English fairy tales, and this is just a collection of native tales, I think. And I even have fairy tales written by Oscar Wilde, which I also did enjoy. Since I'm mentioning Oscar Wilde, let's move on to the classics. I'm going to go through my favourite classics, and then I'm going to move on to the more contemporary stuff, and then the non-fiction later on. This is something I had to read in university, and so I had to buy sort of like the big version. This contains the abridged version and the unabridged version because they had to do a bit of censoring when they first released it. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Here's two Gothic favourites. We've got Dracula by Bram Stoker and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I've also read them for university, but they're great novels, as they are. And then I've got this little book, which is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass in one. And I rather enjoy the Alice in Wonderland story. And I also do like the Disney film. And then one more 19th century example. We've got poems by William Blake. These just show you the illustration. So this is one of the reasons why I decided to buy these, just because I rather like the art of William Blake. So let's move on to my formative teenage years. And we've got two franchises which became really big during that particular time. While I had to wait for the bus to take me back home, I was frequently waiting in the library, so I would just always get books from the library and read them there. And one day I discovered a particular book, and that was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So I got the book, I read it, and I was pretty intrigued and fascinated. So ever since then, I've been a fan of the Harry Potter franchise. Now, I only have one of the books here, which is the Order of the Phoenix. It's the the biggest book of the 7. I don't have all of them, but the rest of them that I do have, I have at home. Now, this one in particular, I have an ambivalent memory of, just because it takes such a long time for Harry Potter to overcome the main antagonist, which, as you can see, is such a big book, and it takes such a long time. It was a real challenge to sit through and read through and just be this frustrated the whole time. So I do remember that very vividly. As far as my favourite Harry Potter book, it might actually be the last one, which I read within 24 hours. And I think I got about 1 hour of sleep. I pre-ordered the book, and then it came, and I started reading, and I just kept reading it all through the night, and I barely got any sleep, and then it was really, really tired at breakfast the next morning, but I had finished it. So that was great. The other book, which is possibly everybody's favourite, this is my version, which is just a collection of them all. When I was a teenager, I first got to know of The Lord of the Rings through the films, and I hadn't really read the books at the time, and I got and read the books in my 20s. But you could call it the gold standard of fantasy altogether. And I think it's great just to have them all just in one. Since I did grow up in Germany, I was mostly reading German books, and one of my favourite authors is German, and he's called Wolfgang Holbein. And him and his wife have written probably between 50 and 100 books, if not more. And a lot of them are young adult fantasy, and some of them are for adults. But this is possibly my favourite one. It's called Wolf's Heart. And without spoiling it too much, it touches on the topic of werewolves. And if you are a German speaker, I would highly recommend this book. To my knowledge, only 2 or 3 of his books have been translated into English, and they're the Märchenmond series, which in English is Magic Moon. So if you want to give it a try, this particular author, you can see if you can get a hold of the Magic Moon saga by Wolfgang Holbein. The next author is a Turkish-German author, and he's written about a cat detective, so it takes on the perspective of the cat. I was lucky enough to find this in the local library in 2019, and I snatched it up. It was free. And this one was the one that I had before. So Feliday, the first one, Francis, the second one. And it's basically a cat detective solving murder mysteries around his local neighbourhood. And for the second one, he ventures further afield. And luckily, these books have been translated into English, so you could definitely find them. And I first came across this when I saw the animation film, which they did for the first book. And that one's available in English as well. Now let's get into the more modern literature. So I have a whole pile here. One genre that I really enjoy is thrillers. So here we have an amazing book. If you've never read it, I would highly recommend it. And that's The Analyst by John Katzenbach. And it's about a psychotherapist who is drawn into a cat and mouse game by an unknown entity. And it's so suspenseful. And then we've got some of my favourite American authors. Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. I think this one's the first one that I've read, Mind Dragon, and it's about a disease that is being bred in a laboratory, and what could possibly go wrong. Very suspenseful. And then Riptide is another standalone one. So if you love thrillers, and there's a bit of an element of the fantastical in there, so they're not purely scientific. So if they're so good at making you believe that what they're saying is real because they make it sound really scientific, but when you check it up, it's actually no, that never happened. So I guess this is the mark of a good storyteller. And then this book is a representative of the Pendergast series, which I'm still trying to keep up with as best as I can. I only have this one book here, and the rest is at my mum's house. And Pendergast is a detective, and he's a bit unconventional. To be fair, he's also very wealthy, which also means that oftentimes the authors can just solve problems by making the character throw some money at it, which is maybe not the most creative way of solving a problem. But as a character, he also has his own depth to him. And if you've never heard of the Pendergast series, or as I said, Preston and Child, I would definitely recommend them. And now I want to talk about another favorite genre of mine, which is dystopian. And all of these books that I'm going to mention now, they could be more or less put into this category. So we've got Clockwork Orange, great film, great book. And then one of my favorites, which is a bit sci-fi, is Jumper. And the book is amazing. And it's about a teenager who discovers that he can teleport away when he is in a precarious situation. And then he starts to use his abilities more often, and there comes a certain point where people start to notice. And they've made a film of it, which, as per usual, wasn't quite as good as the book. However, there was a character in the film that the author himself liked. So he wrote an entire novel about the background story of this character, which is called Griffin Story. And I did rather enjoy both of these books, and I would recommend them. Now, here are some honorable mentions, because I don't have these books in the physical copy. I've read them as in ebooks, and they're just on my computer. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and that's probably one of the main dystopian visions of the future. I do find it a thought-provoking book. To me, it reads more like a satire than an instruction manual. A novel called High Rise by J.G. Ballard. And in that book, society is exemplified in just one high rise. And it's supposed to represent how society is structured between those that live on the bottom and those that live at the top. And then it descends into a bunch of chaos and survival of the fittest, kind of. It's a very clever satire as well of our society. Another novel is called Into the Forest by Jean Hegland, and that one is a bit post-apocalyptic. It's about two teenage sisters who are basically on their own in their parents' house after both of the parents have passed away, and they have to make do. And this is in the post-apocalyptic setting where society has broken down, and they have to survive on their own. And it's a really fascinating tale. There's also a Japanese novel called From the New World, written by Yusuke Kishi. In Japanese, it's called Shinsekai Yori, and I first watched the anime. And then when I heard it was a novel, I kind of wanted to read it, and the person on the internet actually translated it from Japanese into English. And if you Google it, you might still be able to find it. But that was an amazing novel. The premise is also post-apocalyptic, where humans in the future have developed special powers. And in the process of using these special powers, the environment around them gets transformed by these special powers. If you can get a hold of either the anime or the translation of the novel, or if you've learned Japanese, then they clearly are amazing. Well done. But if you can get a hold of it, I would really recommend it. And then one last thing, this is a bit more of a popular series, but eventually I decided to also read The Hunger Games in my 20s. And my expectations weren't particularly high. I was aware of the films, but I was pleasantly surprised by the Hunger Games trilogy. Now, speaking of the Hunger Games trilogy, this segues into my non-fiction books, because I got the unofficial Hunger Games Wilderness Survival Guide. So this is a person who's writing books about survival and prepping and so on, and he's trying to win over a new market, namely people who read the Hunger Games. But this is actually a really good book, and it contains lots of pictures and instructions, and this is probably a book that I would pack if I wanted to exit quickly when society is breaking down. I personally think these kinds of things happen very gradually, but I would still love to be able to do all of the tricks in this book just in case I get lost in the woods, or if I come down in the plane crash, because you never know. Here's a book I picked up for £1 in the uni book sales. This is like the 70s copy. The Black Arts by Richard Cavendish. And there's more recent pressings as well, because I found out that my partner had a new pressing. And we both read the same book. And it really is just a collection of different ways of divination. So for example, numerology is in here. You've got a chapter about Kabbalah, just a little bit about astrology, palmistry, a little bit of history of occult practices and so on. And it was a very interesting read. Here's a book that my partner bought for himself. I think he wanted to read it as a text. This is the Adi Parva, the Hindu creation story. And it turned out to be a beautiful comic book. And I really enjoyed reading this comic once I got into it. The art in here is beautiful, and I always appreciate art. So something like this. And the story was very engaging and interesting as well. So this is why it turned out to be one of my favourite books. So then here's a few more non-fiction books that I've read as ebooks. We've got 10% Human, How Your Body's Microbes Hold the Key to Health and Happiness by Alana Collin. And this is basically a book about your gut microbiome, how it's impacted by everything in your environment, by your diet and so on, by your behaviours. And this is very fascinating to me. The book to me is important just because it did shift something in my approach to health and food that I was eating, and it did subsequently make a lot of changes to my diet as a result of this book, basically prioritizing my gut health over a lot of what you would call personal enjoyment. So as a result, I ended up cutting out a lot of sugar of my diet. So it's a rather influential book, even though I've only read it as an ebook. There's two more books which have a more scientific character. There's a book called Astrology in Ancient Mesopotamia by Michael Bajent. And that was a fascinating read just because it goes back to the very beginning of astrology, when it wasn't used for the individual, but it was basically magic used to protect the kingdom or the whole empire, where the king had all these astrologers, astronomers who would watch the sky for omens, and then they would have to perform a specific ritual to mitigate the ill effects of a certain thing. And this is one of the first written instruction manuals that these astrologers were passing on to other astrologers and writing them down on clay tablets. And this also kind of falls in with the topic of archaeology. And in that vein, I've also read a book called A History of Science in World Cultures by Scott L. Montgomery and Alok Kumar. And it tells you about the development of science basically all over the world, including Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, and so on and so forth. Then I've read a few more books which have more of a spiritual background. I've read The Sacred Enneagram by Christopher L. Hertz. And if you've not heard of the Enneagram, it's a very interesting personality theory where people are divided into 9 types based on their childhood trauma that they experience. And this book was a very succinct introduction to the topic. And then another book which has been recommended to me by a YouTuber, and that's a book called Flow by an author with a very complicated name. I think it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And the concept is that there's such a thing as a flow state where you find the right balance between something that is challenging and where you can use your skills. So it's neither too easy for you nor too difficult. And it's also a bit of a life philosophy. So rather than aiming for happiness, one can aim for being in flow as much as possible. And then one more eye-opening book is called Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion by Elizabeth L. Klein. And I've read this, I think, probably 10 years ago already. And it's basically about fast fashion and how cheaply produced clothes don't benefit anybody in the long run. And nowadays, this is a really big topic and a lot of people are talking about it. But back in the day, this was sort of at its beginning stage. And basically, after reading this book, I decided to only shop secondhand. And I've been shopping secondhand ever since. And so you could call it a pretty influential book. And the woman is a journalist who went to China and looked at all the different factories and so on. And she's done a really good job at laying it all out. Finally, I want to mention 3 more books, which are in the format of encyclopedia, pretty much. This big book, The Art of Fermentation by Sandra Ellis Katz. There's a certain crowd on Instagram which will be very familiar with this book. It basically contains lots and lots of different recipes of how to ferment foods from all over the world, and it's just a great Bible for a healthy gut. That was one of the things I got into after reading things about gut health. It's like, yeah, really, you should eat all these tasty foods that are processed by bacteria, because not only are they nutritious, they're also healthy. And eventually I decided to buy this book in its physical form just to have it. Here's a book I haven't yet fully gotten into, but this is called Practical Self-Sufficiency, and it's basically a guide to lots of self-sufficiency techniques. And my ultimate goal in life is to have my own property, grow my own food, have some of my own animals, and just kind of live as self-sufficient as possible. So I'm very looking forward to moving and attempting to put into practice what's in this book. And the very last book is a massive book. It's called the Illustrated Signs and Symbols Source Book, and it's an encyclopedia of all kinds of symbols. We've got animals. Here's an example of what it looks like, and it's just a collection of lots of different meanings and just whatever association exists with all the different things in the world. This is not really a book that you necessarily sit down and read all the way through, not for me at the very least, but every now and then I can just flick through it, or if there's something specific I want to know, I'm going to reach for this book. So that was pretty much it. I hope you find it interesting. I used to read so much when I was a teenager, and my reading habits have kind of scaled back a little bit. I don't read quite as many books, but I feel like I have the gift to pick just the right books for myself. So when I do read non-fiction, and to be fair, I find it much easier to read fiction. I can just read fiction. Like once I start a fiction book that is really good, I don't want to put it down and I just keep reading it. But when it comes to fiction, I like to take my time and take notes, so it can take a very long time. But I feel like the fiction books that I do pick end up being quite impactful for my own life. So you can leave some of your favorite books down in the comments, or maybe if you have some recommendations based on what I've already shown you. If you think there's something that I should really read, then I'd be happy to hear, and thank you for watching.